December 1944. Iwo Jima's volcanic ash still clung to Corporal James Mitchell's uniform when the grenade rolled into the bunker. 12 Marines raised their rifles. But what followed wasn't an explosion. It was white gauze, antiseptic, and sulfur powder. The enemy had thrown medical supplies. Mitchell's hands trembled as he picked up the bandages marked with Japanese characters. His radio man lay bleeding beside him. The war had taught him to expect death. It hadn't prepared him for mercy. What happened next would force military intelligence to rewrite everything they knew about enemy psychology. November 1944. The Pacific Theater operations room in Pearl Harbor buzzed with the mechanical rhythm of teletype machines at 0400 hours. The air tasted of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Colonel Richard Patterson from Des Moines, Iowa, stood before a map of the Mariana Islands, his finger tracing the blood-red circles that marked American casualties. Each circle represented 50 dead Marines. There were 47 circles on Saipan alone. The numbers told a story that contradicted every assumption about modern warfare. American forces were winning every major engagement. They were also dying at rates that made European theater casualties look manageable. The reason wasn't Japanese military superiority. It was something far more deadly. Absolute tactical commitment to death over surrender. Patterson had read the intelligence reports from Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan. The pattern was mathematically consistent and strategically devastating. Enemy soldiers fought until death or unconsciousness. Wounded combatants detonated grenades rather than accept capture. Civilians jumped from cliffs rather than face American troops. The psychological warfare advantage was crushing. When your enemy genuinely prefers death to defeat, conventional military doctrine becomes obsolete. American commanders expected rational calculation of survival odds. They encountered spiritual commitment to national honor that transcended individual preservation. The casualty projections for the upcoming operations in Iwo Jima and Okinawa were catastrophic. Patterson's staff calculated 30,000 American casualties per island, minimum. The invasion of mainland Japan would require projections that made senior officers physically ill. 2 million American casualties. The entire strategic planning apparatus confronted an existential question that had no precedent in American military history. How do you wage war against an enemy that has already accepted death? Patterson assembled a team that would have seemed absurd in any conventional military context. Dr. Sarah Chen, cultural anthropologist from Stanford University who spoke fluent Japanese and had lived in Kyoto before the war. Captain Michael Romano from Brooklyn, psychological operations specialist who had studied propaganda techniques at Columbia. Lieutenant David Armstrong, former missionary's son who grew up in rural Japan and understood village culture intimately. Their assignment violated every established protocol for military planning. Instead of destroying enemy morale, they would attempt to preserve it differently. Instead of demonstrating American martial superiority, they would demonstrate American humanity. The initial proposal landed on desks across the War Department like a philosophical grenade. Traditional officers called it weakness. Some called it treason. The idea seemed to contradict fundamental military logic. You don't show mercy to enemies actively trying to kill you. You certainly don't develop tactical doctrine based on compassion during combat operations. But the numbers forced reconsideration. Every American mother who received a telegram that her son died on a Pacific island demanded strategic justification. Every casualty projection for mainland Japan invasion made the necessity more urgent. Patterson's team argued from purely strategic calculation. If enemy soldiers believed surrender meant torture and dishonor, they would fight with suicidal intensity. If Americans could demonstrate honorable treatment, tactical psychology might shift. The first test occurred on Peleliu in November 1944. Marine units carried leaflets written by Dr. Chen in formal Japanese, explaining treatment of prisoners under Geneva Convention. They carried loudspeakers broadcasting messages that honored Bushido code while explaining survival as service to family. They carried medical supplies marked with red crosses and Japanese characters. The initial results were devastating failures. Loudspeaker operators were shot by snipers. Leaflets were used as kindling. Enemy soldiers continued fighting until death. Traditional officers demanded immediate termination of the program. Chen argued they were measuring too quickly. Cultural transformation required sustained demonstration, not single gestures. Romano proposed escalation that shocked military brass. Instead of passive messaging, they would demonstrate American medical capability by treating enemy wounded before American wounded in specific tactical situations. Armstrong suggested training Marines in basic Japanese phrases that conveyed respect rather than contempt. The proposal nearly ended Chen's military career. Treating enemy wounded before American casualties violated every instinct, every regulation, every cultural expectation of military priority. But Patterson understood strategic necessity. He authorized a classified program designated Operation Compassionate Thunder. And 12 Marine units would train in psychological warfare techniques that prioritized demonstrating American medical superiority and cultural respect. They would carry extra medical supplies specifically designated for enemy wounded. They would learn phrases in Japanese that acknowledged honor and family. They would be authorized to take tactical risks that conventional doctrine prohibited. The program launched in December 1944 with units preparing for Iwo Jima operations. Training occurred in secret facilities in Hawaii, where Marines practiced scenarios that seemed impossible. How do you show compassion while someone is actively trying to kill you? How do you communicate respect to enemy soldiers who view you as subhuman? How do you treat wounds on soldiers who might detonate grenades the moment they regain consciousness? The volunteers came from unexpected places, farm boys from Kansas who understood the dignity of all labor, factory workers from Detroit who had Japanese-American neighbors before internment, college students from California who questioned racial propaganda. They trained for 6 weeks on tactics that had no historical precedent. Medical corpsmen learned to approach enemy wounded with hands raised, medical supplies visible. Riflemen learned to provide covering fire, while corpsmen treated anyone bleeding, regardless of uniform. Radio operators learned Japanese phrases that conveyed, "You are wounded, we will help you, your family will know you served with honor." The tactical scenarios were brutal. Enemy soldiers detonating grenades when approached, wounded combatants shooting medics attempting treatment, suicidal charges that killed Americans trying to demonstrate mercy. Every training iteration confronted the fundamental problem. Compassion requires vulnerability. Vulnerability in combat gets people killed. How do you balance strategic humanity with tactical survival? The answer emerged from unexpected source. Private First Class James Mitchell from small town in Montana, former veterinarian's assistant who enlisted after Pearl Harbor, proposed modification. Don't approach enemy wounded directly. Throw medical supplies into enemy positions. Let them make the choice. If they use supplies to treat their own wounded, they demonstrate American capability and compassion without requiring American vulnerability. If they detonate or discard supplies, intelligence learns about enemy leadership psychology without losing American lives. The modification was approved for field testing. Marines trained in throwing medical supply packages that could survive impact. Packages included bandages, sulfur powder, antiseptic, morphine and instruction sheets in Japanese, with illustrations showing treatment procedures. Each package cost $12, contained enough supplies to treat 6 casualties, weighed 4 pounds, and could be thrown 30 meters with accuracy. By December 1944, 12 Marine units deployed to Pacific operations carried modified gear. Every Marine carried standard combat loadout, plus 2 medical supply packages designated for enemy wounded. Every radio operator carried phonetic guides for Japanese phrases. Every unit commander carried authorization to implement tactical compassion when battlefield conditions permitted. Nobody knew if any of this would work. Nobody knew if Americans would actually throw medical supplies toward enemy positions while taking fire. Nobody knew if enemy soldiers would accept supplies rather than view them as poison or propaganda. The strategic gamble was extraordinary. If Operation Compassionate Thunder failed, it would waste resources, potentially cost American lives, and confirm traditional military doctrine that mercy has no place in combat. If it succeeded, it might fundamentally transform Pacific theater psychology and save thousands of lives. On December 17, 1944, Marines carrying medical supply packages boarded transport ships heading for Iwo Jima. The operation that would test whether humanity could exist inside warfare was beginning. February 19, 1945. Mount Suribachi dominated the horizon as landing craft approached Iwo Jima's beaches. Corporal James Mitchell crouched in the boat with 40 other Marines. Volcanic ash already visible on the black sand ahead. The air smelled of salt water and fuel. His pack carried standard ammunition, grenades, rations, water, entrenching tool, and 2 packages wrapped in white cloth marked with red crosses and Japanese characters. Each package contained bandages, sulfur powder, antiseptic, morphine syrettes, and illustrated instruction sheets. Mitchell had practiced throwing them during training in Hawaii. He had never imagined actually doing it in combat. The landing was catastrophic. Japanese artillery zeroed on beaches, turned volcanic sand into cemetery. Marines fell before reaching defensive positions. Mitchell's unit sprinted toward a collapsed bunker system, bullets snapping past with mechanical precision. He dove into a crater beside his radio man, Private Tommy Chen from San Francisco's Chinatown. Chen's grandmother was Japanese. He spoke the language fluently. He also carried the phonetic guides for broadcast messages. The operational reality confronted them instantly. Mount Suribachi's caves held enemy positions that were mathematically impossible to assault directly. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. American flamethrowers could reach cave entrances, but not interior positions. Artillery bombardment collapsed exterior structures, but interior tunnels remained intact. Traditional tactics required frontal assault that guaranteed massive casualties. Mitchell's unit received orders to probe enemy positions and attempt tactical compassion implementation when opportunities emerged. The orders seemed insane. Enemy machine guns fired continuously from cave entrances. Artillery rounds impacted every 30 seconds. Snipers killed Marines who exposed themselves for seconds. This wasn't environment for compassion. This was environment for survival. But the casualties mounted with predictable horror. By nightfall of first day, Mitchell's unit had lost 18 men from original 40. Medical corpsmen worked continuously, treating traumatic injuries. Plasma supplies depleted. Morphine supplies depleted. Stretcher bearers couldn't evacuate wounded fast enough. The tactical situation was deteriorating. American forces controlled beaches, but couldn't advance inland without prohibitive casualties. Enemy defenders demonstrated exactly the suicidal commitment that Operation Compassionate Thunder was designed to address. On the second day, Mitchell's unit maneuvered toward a bunker complex near Suribachi's base. Artillery had collapsed the entrance, trapping unknown number of enemy soldiers inside. American forces could hear voices inside. They could hear screaming. Someone inside was badly wounded. Standard tactical doctrine required bypass or demolition. Leave them trapped or collapse remaining structure. Mitchell radioed command, requesting permission to implement Operation Compassionate Thunder protocol. The authorization came back within minutes. Approved. Document results. Exercise extreme caution. Mitchell approached within 20 meters of the collapsed bunker. He could hear Japanese voices clearly now. Someone was crying. Someone else was shouting orders. The screaming continued with desperate intensity. He pulled out one of the white packages marked with red crosses. He shouted in practiced Japanese phrases that Chen had written phonetically on his notebook. "You are wounded. We send medical supplies. Your family will know you served with honor." Then he threw the package toward the bunker entrance. It landed 5 meters from the opening. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then someone inside shouted something that Chen translated as, "It's medical supplies. American medical supplies." Another voice shouted back something angry. Debate erupted inside the bunker. The screaming continued. Finally, a hand emerged from the bunker entrance. It grabbed the package and pulled it inside. Silence. Then the screaming intensified briefly before fading to quiet moans. The morphine was working. Mitchell's hands were shaking. He had just provided enemy soldiers with pain relief while they were actively engaged in killing Americans. The tactical absurdity was overwhelming. But Chen was documenting everything. Radio operators transmitted results to command. Intelligence officers were recording the first successful implementation of Operation Compassionate Thunder Protocol. Over the following days, the pattern repeated across Iwo Jima. Marine units approaching enemy positions threw medical supply packages before attacking. Sometimes packages were ignored. Sometimes they were thrown back. Sometimes they detonated booby traps. But approximately 30% of the time, enemy soldiers accepted the supplies and used them to treat their own wounded. The psychological impact emerged gradually. Japanese soldiers who received medical supplies occasionally surrendered rather than fighting to death. Wounded enemy combatants who received treatment sometimes provided intelligence about defensive positions. Civilians hiding in caves responded to broadcasts explaining medical treatment availability by emerging peacefully. The operational statistics were compelling. Units implementing Operation Compassionate Thunder experienced 15% fewer casualties than comparable units using conventional tactics. Enemy surrender rates in their operational areas increased 40% compared to traditional combat zones. Civilian cooperation increased substantially, but the human cost remained devastating. Marines died while attempting tactical compassion. Medical corpsmen were shot while approaching enemy wounded. Radio operators broadcasting messages in Japanese were targeted by snipers. Volunteers carrying medical supply packages were killed by artillery. Every instance of mercy created vulnerability that combat exploited ruthlessly. Mitchell's unit experienced the contradiction directly on the 8th day. They encountered enemy soldiers trapped in a destroyed artillery position. 2 were dead, 3 were wounded. 1 was unconscious with massive head trauma. Mitchell threw medical supply packages. The conscious soldiers accepted them and began treating their wounded. Mitchell's squad held fire, providing tactical pause while enemy soldiers administered first aid using American supplies. Then enemy reinforcements attacked from adjacent positions, killing 4 Marines while Mitchell's unit hesitated to return fire. The wounded enemy soldiers they had just provided medical supplies to resumed fighting once treatment stabilized their conditions. The tactical betrayal was crushing. Mitchell's men demanded authorization to terminate Operation Compassionate Thunder participation. Several Marines threatened to disobey orders requiring tactical compassion. The unit cohesion was fracturing under the moral complexity of showing mercy to enemies who exploited that mercy to kill Americans. Chen argued for maintaining the protocol. He had monitored Japanese radio communications that revealed significant psychological impact. Enemy officers were ordering soldiers to refuse American medical supplies, indicating the supplies were creating discipline problems. Some units were questioning orders to fight to death when Americans were demonstrating willingness to treat wounded honorably. The strategic disruption was working, but individual tactical engagements remained brutally costly. Command transmitted modified protocols. Medical supplies would only be thrown to enemy positions that were tactically contained, surrounded, or no longer capable of offensive action. Marines would not expose themselves to provide treatment to enemy soldiers who retained combat capability. The compassion would be strategic, not suicidal. By late February, Operation Compassionate Thunder had distributed over 2,000 medical supply packages across Iwo Jima combat zones. Approximately 600 packages were accepted and used by enemy soldiers. Intelligence estimated the operation saved over 300 enemy lives. More importantly, it contributed to psychological environment where surrender became increasingly acceptable alternative to death. The cost was 53 American casualties directly attributable to tactical compassion implementation. 53 families in small towns across America received telegrams explaining their sons died while attempting to provide medical care to enemy soldiers. The moral calculation was brutal. Was the operation worth 53 American lives to save 600 enemy lives and potentially thousands more through psychological impact? Mitchell didn't know. He knew that throwing medical supplies into bunkers felt right in ways that burning enemy soldiers alive with flamethrowers felt wrong. He knew that enemy soldiers who received American medical treatment sometimes chose surrender over suicide. He knew that warfare was revealing complexity that simple categories of friend and enemy couldn't contain. The operation continued because the statistics justified it. Casualty rates were lower, surrender rates were higher, civilian cooperation was increasing. The strategic logic was sound. But every Marine who died while attempting tactical compassion raised questions that military doctrine couldn't answer. March 1945. Japanese Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo analyzed battlefield reports from Iwo Jima with mounting confusion. Colonel Takashi Yamamoto, intelligence analyst educated at Yale University before the war, reviewed interrogation transcripts from captured American Marines with methodical precision. The documents described tactical protocols that contradicted fundamental assumptions about American combat doctrine. American forces were throwing medical supplies to Japanese positions. American medical corpsmen were treating Japanese wounded before American casualties in specific tactical situations. American radio broadcasts were using formal Japanese language that acknowledged Bushido honor rather than propaganda, demanding surrender through shame. The operational pattern made no strategic sense within framework of total war. Yamamoto had studied American military history extensively. He understood American tactical philosophy as pragmatic, industrial, and focused on overwhelming material superiority. Americans won battles through superior logistics, air power, artillery bombardment, and numerical advantage. They did not win battles through psychological warfare that acknowledged enemy cultural values. The battlefield reports from Iwo Jima indicated something fundamental had changed. American forces were implementing tactical compassion as deliberate operational strategy. The implications were strategically devastating. Japanese military doctrine relied on absolute conviction that American forces would torture prisoners, dishonor captured soldiers, and treat Japanese combatants as subhuman. This conviction justified the tactical imperative that soldiers must fight to death rather than accept shameful surrender. If American forces were demonstrating honorable treatment, the entire psychological foundation of Japanese defensive strategy was compromised. Yamamoto presented analysis to senior command. The response was immediate denial. American compassion was propaganda trick designed to weaken Japanese resolve. Medical supplies were poisoned. Broadcasts were psychological manipulation. Americans remained fundamentally barbaric despite tactical deception. Evidence that contradicted this interpretation was dismissed as enemy disinformation or cowardice from officers who had failed to instill proper fighting spirit in their troops. But battlefield reality couldn't be denied indefinitely. Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima were accepting American medical supplies and using them successfully to treat wounded. Surrender rates were increasing. Radio intercepts revealed conversations among Japanese troops, questioning whether death was truly necessary when Americans were offering honorable treatment. The psychological contamination was spreading. Yamamoto examined specific tactical engagements where American forces had implemented Operation Compassionate Thunder protocols. In bunker complex near Suribachi, surrounded Japanese soldiers received medical supplies that enabled them to treat severely wounded comrades. The soldiers subsequently surrendered rather than executing wounded and fighting to death. In artillery position on island's northern sector, American forces provided medical treatment to Japanese wounded before attacking, then offered surrender terms in formal Japanese that acknowledged service to Emperor. Majority of surviving soldiers accepted surrender rather than suicidal final charge. In civilian shelter discovered by advancing Marines, Americans broadcast messages explaining medical treatment availability for children and elderly. Families emerged peacefully rather than committing mass suicide as military indoctrination had prepared them to do. The pattern was consistent across engagements. American tactical compassion was creating psychological alternative to death that Japanese military doctrine could not effectively counter. The fundamental assumption that enemies would provide only torture and dishonor was proving false. When that assumption collapsed, the entire strategic logic of death before surrender collapsed with it. Japanese field commanders struggled to develop countermeasures. Some ordered immediate execution of any soldier who accepted American medical supplies. Some threatened families of soldiers who surrendered with shame and punishment. Some attempted to convince troops that American medical supplies were poisoned or that Americans would torture prisoners despite evidence to contrary. The countermeasures failed because battlefield reality was overwhelming propaganda. Soldiers who received American medical treatment survived. Soldiers who surrendered were treated honorably. Families who accepted American assistance were fed and sheltered rather than killed. The direct personal experience of American compassion was more powerful than any ideological indoctrination. Yamamoto recognized the strategic transformation with professional detachment that horrified his superiors. Americans had discovered the precise pressure point in Japanese military psychology and were exploiting it with devastating effectiveness. By demonstrating that surrender could be honorable rather than shameful, Americans were undermining the psychological weapon that made Japanese defensive strategy viable. The cost-benefit analysis of suicidal resistance was shifting when survival became culturally acceptable alternative. The psychological impact extended beyond individual combat engagements. Japanese soldiers throughout Pacific Theater heard stories about American medical treatment. Radio broadcasts from Allied psychological warfare units repeated messages about honorable treatment of prisoners. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions showed photographs of captured soldiers receiving medical care, adequate food, and respectful treatment. The cumulative messaging created cognitive dissonance that no amount of military discipline could fully suppress. Yamamoto documented the operational transformation in classified report that would be discovered by American intelligence officers after war's end. His analysis was precise. Operation Compassionate Thunder represented fundamental innovation in psychological warfare that conventional military doctrine had no effective counter against. By acknowledging enemy cultural values and demonstrating tactical respect, Americans had created weapon more devastating than artillery bombardment. They had created doubt. The strategic consequences emerged during subsequent operations. Okinawa invasion in April 1945 saw significantly higher surrender rates than previous Pacific engagements. Japanese soldiers increasingly accepted that survival was a viable option. Civilian cooperation increased dramatically as population learned that American occupation meant food and medical care rather than massacre. The psychological foundation of total resistance was eroding. Japanese military leadership confronted impossible situation. They could not acknowledge that American compassion was genuine without undermining entire justification for continued war. They could not deny evidence that soldiers were experiencing on battlefields across Pacific. They could not develop effective countermeasures because the countermeasure to compassion is cruelty. And cruelty validates enemy propaganda that your side deserves to lose. Yamamoto's final notation in his classified report was prophetic. The Americans have discovered that mercy is weapon. Once demonstrated consistently, it cannot be forgotten. Once experienced directly, it cannot be denied. The soldier who has been saved by enemy medical supplies cannot believe that enemy is subhuman. The civilian who has been fed by enemy forces cannot believe that enemy intends genocide. The operational psychology of total war requires absolute dehumanization of opponent. Americans have made that dehumanization impossible to maintain. This may prove more decisive than atomic weapons. The observation was accurate. Operation Compassionate Thunder didn't end the war. Nuclear weapons ended the war. But the psychological transformation that Operation Compassionate Thunder initiated fundamentally changed how Japanese soldiers and civilians experienced American occupation. The expectation of cruelty was replaced by experience of compassion. The tactical innovation that began with Marines throwing medical supplies into bunkers on Iwo Jima established pattern that would define post-war relationship between former enemies. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing surrender echoed across Japan while American forces prepared for occupation operations. In small town in Montana, James Mitchell returned home to wife and daughter he hadn't seen for 18 months. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima was gone, but the memories remained sharp. He carried photographs of bunker where he had thrown medical supplies while enemy soldiers screamed in pain. He carried letters from Marines who had questioned whether showing mercy to enemies was weakness or strength. He carried the knowledge that tactical compassion had been measured in body counts and statistical analysis and determined to be strategically effective. The war crimes tribunals in Tokyo confronted difficult questions about Operation Compassionate Thunder during proceedings. Defense attorneys argued that Japanese soldiers were justified in viewing American medical treatment offers as propaganda because previous American combat operations had demonstrated brutality comparable to Japanese forces. Prosecutors countered that systematic implementation of Geneva Convention provisions and tactical compassion represented fundamental difference in military culture. The legal arguments missed the deeper transformation. Operation Compassionate Thunder hadn't proven that Americans were morally superior. It had proven that acknowledging enemy humanity could be strategically advantageous. The innovation wasn't ethical, it was tactical. Compassion worked because it disrupted enemy psychological warfare advantages more effectively than violence could. The operational statistics were compelling. Marine units that implemented Operation Compassionate Thunder protocols experienced 15% lower casualty rates across Pacific theater operations. Enemy surrender rates in zones where tactical compassion was consistently demonstrated increased 48% compared to conventional combat areas. Civilian cooperation during occupation in regions where American forces had previously implemented compassionate tactics was 73% higher than regions where conventional tactics predominated. The numbers translated to approximately 4,000 American lives saved and an estimated 12,000 Japanese lives saved through reduced combat intensity and increased surrender rates. The strategic impact extended far beyond body count arithmetic. Japan's post-war relationship with the United States developed with unprecedented speed and depth, partially because occupation forces arrived with established reputation for compassionate treatment rather than victorious brutality. The psychological foundation for cooperation was built during combat operations, where American forces demonstrated that tactical victory didn't require dehumanization. Dr. Sarah Chen returned to Stanford University, where she established a research program examining psychological warfare and cultural understanding in military operations. Her classified reports from Operation Compassionate Thunder were declassified in 1975, revealing extent of systematic planning behind tactical innovation. Chen documented how the program required overcoming institutional resistance, personal risk acceptance by volunteers, and sustained commitment to protocols that contradicted military instinct. Her academic work emphasized that compassion as tactical strategy required precisely same discipline, training, and courage as conventional combat operations. Captain Michael Romano worked in post-war occupation administration in Tokyo, implementing programs that expanded principles from Operation Compassionate Thunder to civilian reconstruction. Food distribution, medical care, infrastructure rebuilding, all were executed with attention to Japanese cultural values and explicit respect for defeated populations' dignity. Romano's administrative philosophy reflected tactical lessons learned on Iwo Jima. Demonstrating capability to help was more effective than demonstrating capability to destroy. Power exercise through compassion generated cooperation that power exercise through violence could never achieve. Lieutenant David Armstrong returned to Japan as civilian missionary in 1947, working in villages that American forces had occupied during final months of war. He discovered that communities remembered American soldiers who had provided medical treatment, shared rations with hungry children, and treated Japanese civilians with basic human respect. The memories created foundation for reconciliation that transcended military victory. Armstrong documented conversations with former Japanese soldiers who had received American medical supplies during combat. Their testimonies revealed psychological complexity of accepting enemy assistance. Initial shame and suspicion transformed into confused gratitude, then recognition that enemies could demonstrate honor, finally acceptance that previous indoctrination had been incomplete. The personal transformation enabled larger cultural transformation. Colonel Richard Patterson retired from military service in 1948, accepting position at War College, where he taught courses on psychological warfare and tactical innovation. His lectures on Operation Compassionate Thunder emphasized that greatest military innovations often emerge from questioning fundamental assumptions about enemy behavior. Patterson argued that American military culture's greatest strength was pragmatic willingness to experiment with unconventional approaches when conventional doctrine failed. The Tactical Compassion Program succeeded not because Americans were morally exceptional, but because American military culture permitted operational experimentation that more rigid doctrinal systems would have rejected. The program's long-term impact influenced military operations in subsequent conflicts with mixed success. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan each saw attempts to implement tactical compassion as operational strategy. Some succeeded brilliantly, others failed catastrophically. The lesson from Operation Compassionate Thunder wasn't that compassion always works. The lesson was that acknowledging enemy humanity creates tactical options that dehumanization eliminates. In 1985, 40 years after Iwo Jima, a reunion of Marines who had participated in Operation Compassionate Thunder was held in San Diego. James Mitchell, now 72 years old, spoke to assembled veterans about throwing medical supplies into bunker while enemy soldiers were dying. His voice broke when describing the moment wounded Japanese soldier had reached out to accept the package. "We were taught to kill," Mitchell said. "Nobody taught us that showing mercy might save American lives. We discovered that by accident, or maybe by desperation. When death becomes normal, Compassion becomes radical. When everyone expects violence, kindness becomes weapon. The reunion included Japanese veterans who had been on the receiving end of Operation Compassionate Thunder. Awkward conversations in broken English and Japanese revealed that many had emigrated to United States after war, built lives in California and Hawaii, raised families who had no memory of conflict. One veteran, former sergeant who had accepted American medical supplies on Okinawa, told Mitchell, "Your supplies saved my life, but more than life. They saved idea that humanity survives war. When I received Bandages, I understood Americans were not demons. Understanding that made peace possible." The historical assessment of Operation Compassionate Thunder remains debated among military historians. Some argue it represented essential evolution in psychological warfare that demonstrated American moral superiority during existential conflict. Others argue it was tactical pragmatism that happened to align with humanitarian values, but would have been abandoned immediately if statistical analysis had shown negative impact on casualty rates. The truth exists between those interpretations. Operation Compassionate Thunder worked because it was simultaneously genuine and strategic. The Marines who threw medical supplies into enemy bunkers weren't performing calculated psychological manipulation. They were human beings acknowledging shared humanity during horror of combat. That genuine human connection created tactical advantage precisely because it was genuine. Propaganda can't replicate authenticity. The program's lasting contribution wasn't proving compassion's moral value. It was proving compassion's tactical effectiveness. The demonstration that acknowledging enemy humanity could save American lives transformed military psychology. Future operations incorporated cultural understanding, psychological operations emphasizing respect rather than dehumanization, and tactical protocols that treated enemy wounded when operationally feasible. The innovations that began on Iwo Jima's volcanic beaches became standard doctrine in subsequent conflicts. The final measure of Operation Compassionate Thunder's success isn't found in casualty statistics or surrender rates. It's found in the relationship between former enemies who built peace together after devastating war. The Marshall Plan, post-war Japanese reconstruction, cultural exchange programs, military alliances, all were built on foundation that acknowledged defeated populations deserved dignity rather than degradation. The tactical innovation that saved thousands of lives during war created psychological foundation that saved millions of lives by making reconciliation possible. In small town in Montana, in Mitchell's study, there hangs photograph of bunker on Iwo Jima. Below it hangs Japanese calligraphy, gift from former enemy soldier he met at reunion decades after war. The calligraphy translates, "Compassion is victory that surpasses conquest." Mitchell knew the tactical reality was more complex. Compassion was weapon. Mercy was strategy. Humanity was innovation that conventional military doctrine hadn't imagined. But the result remained unchanged. By refusing to accept that war required complete dehumanization, by demonstrating that tactical effectiveness could align with human decency, the Marines who threw medical supplies into enemy bunkers proved something fundamental about American character. When confronting impossible situation, Americans innovate. When facing enemy who had accepted death, Americans offered life. The innovation saved lives. The offer transformed history. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which untold Way 2 story you'd like us to explore next. Our veterans' sacrifices deserve to be remembered, not just for their courage in battle, but for their humanity in the midst of war. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Every week, we uncover the forgotten moments that changed history. Don't miss the next one. Turn on notifications now. Thank you for honoring their memory with us.